Morning everyone. Hi, today in this video we are going to discuss about the quantitative instruments to control the money supply. I repeat, in this video we are going to understand the quantitative methods to control money supply. Well, you will be knowing that in the last video we talked about the qualitative methods, in which we talked about three basic points, that is moral suasion, rationing credit and margin requirement. Today we are going to understand the concept of quantitative instruments, where quantitative instruments are those instruments in which money supply is controlled in the economy. Now let's try to understand each point in detail. The first quantitative instrument that is taken by the RBI, that is controlled by RBI, is CRR, and the second point is SLR. Well, the full form of CRR is cash reserve ratio. Full form of SLR is statutory liquidity ratio. Cash reserve ratio and statutory liquidity ratio. Now first let's understand what is CRR. CRR is the minimum percentage of the bank's total deposits which is kept with RBI. I repeat, CRR is the minimum percentage of any bank's total deposits which is required to be kept by with the RBI. On the other side, SLR is the particular percentage of assets, in the form of liquid assets kept, which is called SLR. Now let me repeat again. Cash reserve ratio is the minimum percentage of the bank's total deposit which it has to keep with the RBI, while SLR is the fixed percentage of the assets kept, that is liquid assets, which include cash, gold, which includes cash and gold. Now both these rates, that is of CRR and SLR, they are fixed by the RBI and they keep changing depending upon the situation in the economy, that is inflation or deflation. Now let me give you a brief example of what is done during the period of inflation. Well, during inflation, when there is a general increase in the price of goods, the CRR is increased. Now what happens is, when CRR is increased, a higher percentage of bank's deposit goes to RBI. When a higher percentage of deposits goes to RBI, it means the banks has less money to give as loans to the public. When banks have less money to give as loans, genuinely the people will receive less money, and when they receive less money, they will demand less, and when they demand less, inflation gets reduced. Similarly, for SLR, what happens is, during the time of inflation, the percentage of the liquid assets which is kept aside is also increased. Now when more of the liquid assets is kept aside, is kept in safe, then less money remains available for giving loans into the public, which reduces the money supply by the commercial banks. And whenever the money supply by the commercial banks get reduced, inflation gets controlled. Third point is, after CRR and SLR, is repo rate. Repo rate and reverse repo rate. So let me repeat. The first point is CRR, second point is SLR, third point is repo rate, fourth point is reverse repo rate. Well, before I explain you the definition of the term repo rate, let me tell you that the full name of repo rate is repurchase rate. What is this rate? The rate at which the RBI gives short-term loans to banks, commercial banks, is called repo rate. The rate at which RBI offers short-term loans to the commercial banks is called repo rate, while the rate at which RBI accepts the deposit from commercial banks is called reverse repo rate. The rate at which RBI gives short-term loans to commercial banks is called repo rate. Now, when inflation needs to be controlled, repo rates is increased. When inflation needs to be controlled, repo rate is increased. What happens is when repo rate is increased, it means RBI is giving loans to the commercial banks at a higher rate of interest. When repo rate is increased, the RBI gives commercial banks loan at a higher rate of interest. Now, we all know that commercial banks works for the profit maximization. When it gets loan at a higher rate of interest, what it will do is it will also give public loans at a higher rate of interest. Now, at this higher rate, less number of people demand for loan, which reduces the money supply by the commercial banks, because of which inflation gets controlled. Now, as far as reverse repo rate is concerned, what is reverse repo rate? Reverse repo rate is the rate at which RBI accepts the deposit from the commercial banks. Means whenever commercial banks keep their deposits in RBI, RBI gives them certain rate, and this rate is called reverse repo rate. Now, during the time of inflation, reverse repo rate is increased. When reverse repo rate is increased, what happened is more of the funds, more of the money which is there kept in RBI, which is there kept in the commercial banks, goes to RBI. When more money goes to RBI, it means commercial banks are left with lesser money. When they are left with lesser money, when they are left with lesser funds, the demand for credit, that is the demand for loan, gets reduced. The moment the demand for credit gets reduced, money supply gets reduced, and when money supply gets reduced in the economy, it leads to controlling of inflation. The fifth point is bank rate. Well, bank rate is similar to repo rate, where bank rate also means that it is the rate of interest at which RBI lends money to commercial banks. However, bank rate is the rate of immediate loan requirement, while repo rate is the rate given at the loans for short term period. Now, the effect of bank rate during inflation is same as that of repo rate, where in inflation bank rate is also increased so that RBI charges a higher rate of interest from the banks, and when banks gets loan at higher rate, they will also charge loan from the public at a higher rate, which will lead to less number of people demanding loans from the banks. And when less number of people demand loans from the banks, the money supply gets reduced, and when money supply gets reduced, inflation gets controlled. I hope with this you understand the meaning of how does RBI through its qualitative instruments control the situation of inflation. Please understand, during the time of deflation, the exactly opposite happens as to what happens in inflation. During deflation, exactly opposite happens in the market as to what happens during inflation. I hope this gives you a clear understanding. Thank you everyone.